There is a word that people in one very small profession use about 40 times a day, and almost nobody else has ever said out loud. The word is traceability. It means that a measurement is only worth something if you can follow it backward. If a pharmacy scale says a vial holds 2 grams, that number is only real if that scale was checked against a weight, and that weight was checked against a better weight, and that better weight was checked against a national standard sitting in a climate-controlled vault, and every single one of those comparisons was written down, signed, and dated. Break one link anywhere in that chain, and the number on the screen is not a measurement anymore. It is just a rumor with a decimal point in it. I bring that up because the man in this story spent 19 years of his life protecting chains like that. He drove a van full of certified weights around one county in Indiana, making sure that the machines people trusted were actually telling the truth. And then one Tuesday afternoon in October, his 8-year-old son came home from school, stood in the kitchen doorway with his backpack still on both shoulders, and would not take it off. My name is Nathan, and I want to tell you what that father did in the next 4 minutes, because he did almost nothing, and the almost nothing is the entire reason this story ends the way it does. Most people, when they finally see the thing they have been half noticing for a year, reach for it. They grab it. They want to hold the proof in their hands. He didn't. He stood there with his arms at his sides like a man at a funeral, and the reason he stood there is the most useful thing I have ever learned from a story like this one. Barrett Loomis measured things for a living, and he was good enough at it that other people's licenses depended on his signature. His company was called Loomis Metrology and Scale, and it operated out of a converted feed store on Quarry Street in Winslow Gap, Indiana, a town of about 11,000 people in Ellery County that had once made cast iron radiators and now mostly made nothing. The shop had 2 rooms. The front room had a counter and a coffee maker and a wall of framed accreditation certificates. The back room was the one that mattered. It was kept at 68 degrees, plus or minus 1, with a humidity readout on the wall that Barrett checked the way other men check the weather. And in the middle of it, on a granite table that weighed 900 pounds and sat on its own isolated slab, poured through a hole cut in the original floor, was the comparator. Inside a locked steel cabinet next to it lived the weights. They came in fitted mahogany cases lined with felt, in sets that stepped down from 20 kilograms to a milligram, and Barrett handled them the way other people handle newborns, which is to say never with bare skin. Fingerprints have mass. A single thumbprint left on a 1 kilogram stainless steel standard adds enough oil and salt to matter at the level Barrett worked at, and so the cases came with ivory-tipped tongs and lint-free gloves, and every technician who ever worked for him learned in his first hour that you do not touch the weights, you do not breathe directly on the weights, and you do not put a weight down anywhere except in the exact felt socket it came out of. His mentor had taught him that. Ozzie Tinsley founded the lab in 1981, after 20 years as a weights and measures inspector for the state, and Ozzie's whole philosophy fit on an index card taped inside the cabinet door in handwriting that had gotten shakier every year. Every number belongs to somebody. Ozzie liked to explain that to new hires with a story about a truck scale at a grain elevator that read 40 pounds light. 40 pounds on a 50,000-pound load is nothing, statistically. It's less than 0.1%. It's a rounding error. And Ozzie would let that sit, and then he'd say, "That scale ran 11 years, 400 loads a season, and every one of those 40 pounds came out of a farmer's check. Do the arithmetic, and you have stolen a man's tractor 1 bolt at a time, and he never even knew he was being robbed, because the machine told him a number, and the number felt about right." Barrett had that arithmetic in his bones by the time he was 25. He knew that theft at scale never looks like theft. It looks like a slightly wrong number, repeated patiently, by a machine nobody thinks to question. His route covered 4 counties. On Mondays he did the grain co-ops and the 2 remaining foundries. Tuesdays and Wednesdays were medical, which by the fall of that year meant 6 independent pharmacies, 2 hospital pharmacies, a veterinary clinic, a fertility lab in Bloomington that paid triple for after-hours work, and the newest and largest account on his books, a company called Vesper Care Partners that ran hospice services across most of southern Indiana, and, attached to it, a compounding and home infusion pharmacy in a low brick building out by the interstate. Thursdays he did jewelers and coin shops, which he liked because the owners were old and talkative and always had coffee. Fridays he did paperwork, and paperwork in his trade is not filler. Every calibration generated a certificate, and every certificate had 2 sets of numbers on it. As found, which is what the instrument read when he walked in. As left, which is what it read when he walked out. Most people who receive a calibration certificate only ever look at as left, because as left is the one that says the machine is fine now. Barrett kept as found data going back 19 years. Every instrument, every visit, on a server in the back room, and mirrored to a drive in a fireproof box, because Ozzy had told him once that as found is where the story is. As left tells you the machine is fixed. As found tells you what the machine has been quietly doing to somebody since the last time you came. He was 41 years old that October. He was a big man who moved carefully, the way people do when they have spent their working life around things that break if you bump them. He drank his coffee black because cream is a variable. He owned 4 identical pairs of work boots. He had a laugh that came out about once a week and surprised people when it did. And he had a son named Isaac, who everybody called Ike, who was 8 years old and in 2nd grade at Wexford Elementary, and who was, in Barrett's own private and completely biased opinion, the single best thing that had ever happened in the state of Indiana. Ike was a counter, not in the clinical way, in the delighted way. He counted the steps from the van to the shop door, and there were 19, and he announced it every single time as if the number might have changed overnight. He counted the ceiling tiles in the dentist's office. He had a jar of tumbled stones from a rock shop in Bedford, and he could tell you there were 62 of them without looking, and if you moved one, he knew. Barrett had a theory that this was not genetic so much as absorbed, that a kid who spends Saturdays sitting on a stool in a calibration lab watching a man put small metal cylinders on a pan with tongs is going to come out of it with an unusual relationship to quantity. Ike's mother did not think that was as charming as Barrett did. Delaney Loomis had been Delaney Stroud when Barrett met her, 26 years old and working the front desk at the Ellery County Community Hospital. And the thing he had loved about her from the first week was that she was warm at people the way he was careful at objects. She could make a terrified 80-year-old with a broken hip laugh in under a minute. She remembered the names of everybody's grandchildren. When Barrett's mother was dying in 2019, Delaney was the one who sat with her at 3 a.m. and read her the racing form, because that was what the old woman wanted. And Barrett had watched that and thought, whatever else happens in my life, I chose right on this one. She had come up hard. The Strouds lived on Tillinghast Road in a house that always had one project half finished on the porch. Her mother, Coral, worked doubles at a nursing home for 31 years and retired with no pension and a bad shoulder. Her brother Deke had gotten into and out of trouble on a rotating schedule since he was 15. Delaney had watched money be the reason for everything in her family, the reason people yelled, the reason people stayed, the reason her mother came home smelling like other people's laundry, and she had made herself a promise as a teenager that she would never be a woman who counted. Barrett understood that promise. He also understood, later, much later, that a promise like that is not really a promise. It is a pressure, and pressure has to go somewhere. She started at Vesper Care Partners in 2022, first as a scheduler, then as an intake and bereavement coordinator, which meant she was the person who sat at kitchen tables with families on the worst week of their lives and explained what hospice would and would not do. She was extraordinary at it. Barrett went with her to a company dinner once and watched 4 different families' worth of people come up to her in a hotel ballroom to say she had been the only human being in the whole process. He had never been prouder of anybody. He also noticed, that same night, the way a man across the room looked at his wife when she laughed. Everett Voiles was 49 and had the specific handsomeness of a man who had been handsome at 25 and had spent every year since maintaining it at some cost. He was VP of Clinical Operations, which at Vesper meant he ran everything that touched a patient without ever touching one himself. He had come out of pharmaceutical sales, then a chain of urgent cares, then a durable medical equipment outfit in Ohio that had been sold in a hurry, and he told the story of his career like a man describing a series of rescues he had performed on companies that could not manage themselves. He shook Barrett's hand that night and said, "You're the scale guy." And Barrett said, "That's right." And Everett said, still smiling, We spend an ungodly amount of money on you people. Barrett said, you spend it on the license, not on me. And Everett laughed like it was a joke and moved on. And Barrett stood there for a second with the distinct feeling of having been measured by an instrument that was out of tolerance. Money started showing up about 8 months later. Not in a dramatic way. A new washer and dryer that Delaney said was a floor model. A trip to Gatlinburg with her mother. A watch for Barrett's birthday that he wore twice and then quietly put in a drawer because he had looked it up. She said the word bonus a lot that year, and then she said the word stipend, and then she started saying nothing at all, which is when Barrett began to feel the shape of a thing he could not name. He was not a suspicious man. He was worse than that. He was a patient one. And a patient man does not confront. A patient man starts keeping data. Ainsley Ruddock had been teaching second grade at Wexford Elementary for 11 years, and running the aftercare program in the cafeteria for 6 of them. And if you had asked her what her actual job was, she would have told you that about 80% of it was noticing. She noticed who came to school with a coat and who came with a hoodie in November. She noticed which kids ate everything on the tray, including the cooked carrots, because that told you what dinner was like. She noticed the ones who flinched at a dropped book and the ones who didn't flinch at anything, which was worse. 11 years of that, and a person develops something that isn't quite intuition, because intuition sounds like a guess. It's closer to a memorized baseline. She knew what normal looked like on 240 children, and deviations announced themselves to her the way a wrong note announces itself to a piano tuner. She had a reason for being that way, and the reason had a name. Her brother Miles was 4 years older than her, and he had been the funny one, the one who could do voices, the one who taught her to drive in a church parking lot in a Buick with a bad transmission. He hurt his back framing houses in 2016. He got prescribed what everybody got prescribed. When the prescriptions stopped, he found other arrangements, and in March of 2019, at 31 years old, in a rented room in Terre Haute, Miles Ruddock died of what the toxicology report described as acute fentanyl intoxication. Ainsley went to the hearing. She sat in a room in Indianapolis and listened while a board attorney explained, without any apparent discomfort, that the patches in question had most likely come out of a legitimate supply chain somewhere and been diverted, and that diversion cases were extraordinarily difficult to pursue because the paperwork almost always balanced. That was the phrase that stayed with her for 6 years. The paperwork almost always balanced. So when a child in her aftercare program started doing something small and strange, she did not talk herself out of it. It started in September. Ike Loomis was a kid she liked enormously. A chatty, sunny, mathematical kid who narrated his own snack. Then one afternoon, she watched him take his lunch bag out of his backpack and hand it, still zipped, to a man in the pickup lane and get back in line with the other kids, and the man drove away. That was it. That was the whole thing. She stood there with a clipboard against her chest and turned it over and could not make it mean nothing. The man was on the pickup list. That was the first thing she checked, because she is not a person who accuses. Cal Brodeen, listed as a family friend, added to Ike's authorized pickup card in August, in handwriting she recognized from every form in the file, because Ike's mother filled out all the forms. But he never picked Ike up. He took a lunch bag from a second grader in the pickup lane at 4:15, roughly every 8 to 10 days, and drove off. And Ike went back inside and waited for his mother at 5:30 like nothing had happened. The second thing Ainsley did was start writing it down. Date, time, what she saw, in a spiral notebook she kept in her tote bag and not in any school system, because she had learned in 6 years of thinking about her brother that the paperwork almost always balances, and the only records that don't balance are the ones nobody knew you were keeping. The third thing she did was ask Ike about it, once, very lightly, in the way you can ask an 8-year-old a question without him ever knowing he was asked. She said, "Is that your uncle?" And Ike said, "No, that's Mom's friend. I'm not supposed to say." And then he looked genuinely stricken, the way kids do when they realize a sentence got away from them. And he said, "I mean, it's not a secret. It's just a thing. It's just a thing." She wrote that down too. By the second week of October, she had 11 entries in the notebook, 11 handoffs. She had also, on the 9th of October, done something that she would later be asked about under oath and would answer without apology. Ike had left his backpack at the aftercare table when he ran to the bathroom, and Ainsley Ruddock, 11-year veteran teacher, unzipped it. The lunch bag inside was a soft-sided insulated one, blue, and it was heavy in a way that lunch is not heavy. She did not open it. She held it for 4 seconds, put it back, zipped the backpack, and sat down in a cafeteria chair because her legs had stopped participating. Then she did the arithmetic that everybody in this story eventually has to do. She thought about calling the police, and she thought about the fact that she had touched a child's bag with no warrant and no witness and 11 entries in a notebook she had never told her principal about. She thought about the mother, who was warm and beloved and worked for a hospice company, and who would say, quite reasonably, that a teacher had gone through her son's things. She thought about how fast a thing like that could become a story about a teacher instead of a story about a lunch bag. And then she thought about the father, who she had met exactly 3 times, once at a fall conference where he had asked her 4 questions about Ike's reading fluency and written the answers down in a notebook of his own. On the morning of Tuesday, October 14th, Ainsley Ruddock knelt down next to a desk in room 12 and said, very quietly, to a boy who was drawing a rocket, "Ike, I need you to do something for me today, and it's not a punishment, and you're not in trouble. When you get home this afternoon, before your mom gets there, I need you to show your dad what's in your backpack. Not mom, dad, and you show him the whole thing." And Ike, who was 8 and who counted everything, said, "Okay," and then said, "Is it because it's heavy?" And she said, "Yes, honey, it's because it's heavy." Barrett got home at 4:20 that afternoon because the fertility lab in Bloomington had rescheduled and it had knocked his whole day forward. That detail matters. If the lab hadn't moved, he would have walked in at 6:15 and his wife would have been home for 45 minutes, and the backpack would have been empty and in the hall closet, and none of the rest of this would exist. He was standing at the counter with a bag of coffee in one hand when the storm door banged and Ike came in and stopped in the kitchen doorway. The boy did not put his backpack down. That was the first thing Barrett noticed, because Ike always dropped it, always, right there on the floor, at the exact spot where it made his mother crazy. He stood in the doorway with both straps still on his shoulders and both thumbs hooked under them like a hiker, and he had a look on his face that Barrett had never seen before and did not like at all. Barrett said, "Hey, bud." Ike said, "Dad, my teacher said I should show you before Mom gets home." Barrett put the coffee down. He said, "Show me what?" And Ike walked to the middle of the kitchen and turned around so his back was to his father and shrugged one strap off and swung the pack around and unzipped it and held it open. And then he did not say anything else. He just pointed into it with one finger, the way you point at something in a museum case, and looked up at his father's face to see what his father was going to do. Inside, on top of a math folder and a library book about volcanoes, was a blue insulated lunch bag. It was unzipped about 2 inches at the corner, the way a zipper gets when something inside is too full for it. And through that 2-inch gap, in the yellow kitchen light, Barrett could see the edge of a heat-sealed plastic pouch and a printed lot number, and the corner of a foil-backed square, and underneath that, the flat rectangular shapes of more of them, stacked. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He calibrated the balances that weighed things like that. He had watched a pharmacist in a white coat count them into a tote with 2 other people watching and initialing. He knew what the pouches looked like, and he knew what the foil squares were, and he knew, roughly, standing in his own kitchen holding nothing, what the street value of a bag that heavy would be, because a DEA diversion investigator had explained it to him at a continuing education seminar in Louisville 4 years earlier while they waited for bad conference coffee. His hands wanted to move. Every part of him wanted to take that bag out and open it and look, and that is the moment I want you to sit inside for a second, because everything that happens over the next 14 months of these people's lives runs through it. Barrett Loomis put his hands behind his back. He did it the way you do when you walk into a room full of instruments that don't belong to you. Hands behind the back, weight on the heels, look with your eyes. 19 years of do not touch the weights, of fingerprints have mass, of every number belongs to somebody, and the whole of it came up out of his spine and locked his arms in place. Because he understood something in that kitchen that most people do not understand until a lawyer explains it to them 8 months too late. He understood that the moment his skin touched that bag, it stopped being evidence and started being an argument. He said, in a voice that came out much calmer than he felt, "Ike, I need you to set the whole backpack down on the floor right there. Don't take anything out. Just set it down and step back to me." And Ike did. Barrett looked at the clock on the stove. 4:26. Delaney was never home before 5:25. He took his phone out of his shirt pocket and he took 11 photographs from 4 angles without moving anything, including one that showed the kitchen clock and the backpack in the same frame. He walked to the front window and photographed the driveway, empty. He went out to the van and came back with a roll of tamper-evident evidence tape from the box he used to seal calibration seals on legal-for-trade equipment, and he taped the outer flap of the backpack shut and signed his name across the tape and wrote the date and the time in his small square handwriting and photographed that too. And then he sat down on the kitchen floor next to his son and asked him 3 questions, and only 3, because at a seminar in Louisville, a woman from the Indiana Department of Child Services had once told a room full of contractors and inspectors that the single fastest way to destroy a child's testimony is to ask him a question that contains its own answer. He said, "Do you know what's in the bag?" Ike said no. He said, "Who put it in your backpack?" Ike said, "Mom does. In the morning. She says it's for after school." He said, "What are you supposed to do with it?" And Ike said, "Give it to Cal in the car line." And then his chin started going, and he said, "Am I in trouble?" And Barrett said, "No." And then he said it again, because he could hear that the first one hadn't landed. He said, "Buddy, look at me. You are not in trouble, and you did not do anything wrong, and you did exactly the right thing, and I am so proud of you I can barely see straight." Then he picked up the phone and called the police. He did not call his wife. He did not call his lawyer. He did not call Vesper Care Partners and ask what the hell was going on. He called the non-emergency line for the Winslow Gap Police Department at 4:38 in the afternoon and said, "My name is Barrett Loomis. I'm at 214 Quarry Street. My 8-year-old son came home from school with what I believe to be a quantity of diverted controlled substances in his backpack. I have not touched it. I have sealed it, and I need an officer, and I would like you to notify whoever handles pharmaceutical diversion, because this is going to be bigger than a bag." The dispatcher asked him to repeat the last part. He repeated the last part. The first cruiser came in 11 minutes. The officer who came through the door was 26 years old and had never worked a diversion case in his life, and he did what a 26-year-old does, which was reach for the backpack. Barrett said respectfully, "Please don't," and the kid stopped, and Barrett explained about the tape and the timestamps and the photographs, and the officer got on his radio, and 40 minutes later there was a detective in the kitchen. Rosalind Teague had been a detective for 9 years and had spent 4 of them on a multi-jurisdictional task force before budget cuts sent her back to Winslow Gap. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a full minute without saying anything, looking at a sealed backpack on a linoleum floor with a signature across the tape, and then she looked at Barrett and said, "You did this?" He said, "I calibrate scales. Chain of custody is most of my job." She said, "Mr. Loomis, I have taken evidence off of federal agents that was handled worse than this." They got it open at the kitchen table at 6:10 with 2 officers, a camera, and a form. 22 heat-sealed pouches of oral morphine sulfate concentrate, the kind that comes in small bottles with a calibrated dropper and is used at the very end of a life, when swallowing is hard and pain is not. 31 transdermal fentanyl patches in foil, in 2 dosage strengths. 9 vials of hydromorphone, and a folded piece of paper, torn from a spiral notebook, with 14 sets of initials and numbers on it in 2 different hands. Delaney Loomis pulled into the driveway at 5:41, which is where the report puts her, and there were 3 marked cars and an unmarked one in front of her house. She got out with a grocery bag on her hip, and the officer who watched her walk up the drive wrote in his supplemental narrative that the subject did not ask what happened, did not ask if anyone was hurt, and did not ask about her son. Her first sentence, spoken from 12 feet away, was, "Whatever he told you, he's been building a custody case for a year." Barrett heard that from the kitchen, and later he would say that was the moment, not the backpack. The backpack was a fact, and facts are just facts. It was hearing his wife, from 12 feet outside her own front door, deliver a sentence she had clearly written in advance. She was very good for the next 2 hours. She cried in the right places. She said she had no idea. She said Calibrate was a transport driver from work who had helped her move her mother's furniture, and that the lunch bag was leftovers she sent for him because he was going through a divorce. And when Detective Teague asked why leftovers would be handed off by a second grader in a school pickup line 11 separate times, Delaney's face did something complicated and she asked, for the first time, for a lawyer. The lawyer arrived at 8:19. He came from Indianapolis, which is 71 minutes away in good traffic. He was a partner at a firm whose name was on a building. He was wearing a suit at 8 o'clock at night on a Tuesday, and he knew Detective Teague's captain's first name, and he had a business card with a mobile number on it that he handed to Barrett, unasked, as a courtesy. Barrett stood on his own porch and watched a $2,000 an hour attorney get out of a car in Winslow Gap, Indiana, 26 minutes after the first phone call his wife made, and he did the arithmetic. Not the emotional arithmetic, the metrology arithmetic. You do not get that lawyer that fast because you called him. You get that lawyer that fast because he was already on retainer, for somebody, for exactly this. Which meant this had happened before, and somebody had planned for it happening again. That was the night Barrett Loomis stopped being a man whose wife had done something terrible and became a man standing at the edge of an operation. The counterattack started before he had even changed his shirt. At 9:40 the next morning, a Wednesday, Barrett was served in the parking lot of the shop with an ex parte emergency order alleging that he had a documented pattern of coercive control, that he had recently begun photographing and cataloging his wife's movements, that he kept a quantity of unspecified regulated materials on the premises where the child lived, and that on the evening of October 14th, he had staged a scene involving pharmaceutical products in his own kitchen in order to gain leverage in a custody dispute he had been preparing since the previous winter. 2 of those things were technically true, which is what made it work. He did photograph and catalog. He had a page in a notebook, going back to February, where he had written down every date Delaney said the word bonus and the amount that had appeared afterward, because he was a patient man, and patient men keep data. In the petition, that page was described as surveillance of the petitioner's finances, and there were regulated materials on the premises, in a sense. He held a radioactive materials license for 2 sealed check sources used in density gauge calibration, which lived in a locked lead pig bolted to the floor of the shop, inspected annually, with paperwork 6 inches thick. In the petition, they were unspecified regulated materials in the home. That is what a good lawyer does with a true fact. Ike was not removed from Barrett, which was the one mercy, because Detective Teague had gotten to the DCS assessor first, and there was a forensic interview already scheduled. But there was a no-contact order between Barrett and Delaney went to her mother's on Tillinghast Road, and the house on Quarry Street got very large and very quiet. Then they came for the thing that actually mattered, which was his signature. On the 23rd of October, a man named Ward Fenneman from the Indiana Board of Pharmacy's Inspection Division walked into the shop and asked to see the last 3 years of certificates for Vesper home infusion and compounding. He was polite. He had a leather folio. He explained that in the course of an internal review, Vesper had self-reported a discrepancy in their controlled substance inventory reconciliation, going back approximately 14 months, and that the discrepancy had been traced to a systemic weighing error, and that the balances in question had been under Loomis Metrology's calibration contract. Barrett understood the shape of it before Fenneman finished the sentence. If you steal drugs from a pharmacy, the whole shows up in the reconciliation, because every gram that comes in has to be accounted for by a gram that goes out or a gram that's still on the shelf. Unless the scale that measured what came in was reading high. Then the pharmacy thinks it received more than it did, and the missing amount is not missing at all. It's an instrument error. It's the scale guy's fault. It's a paperwork problem, and paperwork problems get a corrective action plan and a fine, and nobody goes to prison, and the man who signed the certificates loses his accreditation and his business, and incidentally, his credibility as a witness in any proceeding whatsoever, including a custody one. They had not invented the frame on Tuesday night. It had been sitting there since the beginning, the way a fire escape sits on a building. The whole scheme had been built with a designated man to blame, and the designated man had been coming in every 90 days for 2 years with a case of certified weights and a clipboard, drinking their coffee, and thanking them for the business. Fenneman gave him 14 days to respond. By the following Monday, Barrett's ISO 172025 accreditation was under review and had to be disclosed to every client. He lost the hospital system in 4 days. The fertility lab in Bloomington sent a very kind email. The grain co-ops, God bless them, said they'd wait. By the first week of November, Loomis Metrology and Scale had lost 61% of its revenue. Its owner was living alone in a house where a police photographer had taken 40 pictures of the kitchen floor, and the operation that had put 22 pouches of end-of-life morphine into a second grader's backpack had not been so much as inconvenienced. Barrett drove out to Ozzy's on the second Sunday in November because he did not know where else to go with it. Ozzy Tinsley lived in a ranch house on 11 acres with a shop out back bigger than the house, and he had emphysema, and by that fall he was on oxygen full-time and had a chair he did not get out of much. Barrett sat down across from him and laid the whole thing out in order, the way you'd write a report, and when he was done, Ozzy sat there with the cannula in his nose, and the concentrator ticking behind him, and he said, "Well, they picked the wrong instrument." Barrett said, "What does that mean?" And Ozzy said, "Son, they built their whole story on the idea that a scale can drift, and a scale can drift. But you have 19 years of as-found data, and you have never once thrown any of it away. Because I made you promise me you wouldn't when you were 23 years old and thought I was a crank. So go look at it. Don't look at whether the scales were wrong. Everybody already knows the scales were wrong. Go look at how they were wrong." Barrett went back to the shop that night and did not go home for 9 days. Here is what he found, and it is the spine of everything that comes after. A balance that drifts on its own, drifts like a living thing. It goes out of tolerance gradually, in one direction, tracking temperature and humidity, and the slow settling of the building, and it drifts worst at the top of its range where the load is heaviest, and it drifts more in July than in January. That is what natural error looks like. It is a curve. It is boring. Barrett had seen 10,000 of them. The Vesper balances did not do that. There were 5 of them, 3 analytical balances in the compounding room and 2 prescription balances in the dispensing area, and across 14 months, every single one of them had come up as found reading high, and each one had come up high by an amount that was clean. Not clean in the sense of round, clean in the sense of consistent. The same instrument would be out by nearly the identical percentage in February and in August, which is thermodynamically absurd. 2 of them had gone out of tolerance, been corrected by Barrett, and then come back at the next quarterly visit, out by almost exactly the same amount in the same direction, which is not drift. Drift does not remember where it was. And then he found the tells. On balance number 3, in the compounding room, his as-found record from the previous April included a photograph he had taken of the underside of the weighing pan, because there had been a smear of something on it, and he had documented it before cleaning, the way he documented everything. Blown up on a good monitor, the smear was a rectangular residue outline. Adhesive, something flat and light had been taped under that pan and removed, and whatever was taped there had been on and off enough times to leave a ghost. On balance number 1, the environmental log built into the instrument, which almost nobody ever reads and which Barrett downloaded on every visit because Ozzy had told him to, showed a pattern of internal calibration events triggered manually at 4:50 in the morning, when the pharmacy was closed, on 22 occasions in 14 months. A manual internal calibration at 10 minutes to 5 in the morning is not maintenance. It is somebody standing in a dark room, resetting an instrument's idea of 0 after having changed something about it. And on the 2 prescription balances, both of them were models with a magnetic force restoration cell, which means they are exquisitely sensitive to a nearby magnetic field, and both of them had come up high, and only in the compounding suite, and never during the 11 months when the pharmacy's layout had put them on the opposite wall. Barrett Loomis, who had never in his life raised his voice in a professional setting, sat in a 68-degree room at 2 in the morning and understood that somebody had been walking into that pharmacy before dawn with a shim and a magnet and giving the machines a small permanent lie to tell. And then he found the last one, and it was the one that took his legs out. He went back further than the case required. because he was thorough, and because he could not sleep. And in the Vesper Hospice Division's durable medical equipment records, which he had also serviced, there was a list of patients whose home infusion pumps his company had verified for flow rate accuracy. And on the list from the previous March, on page 4, in a column of 11 names, was Tinsley, Oswald R. Ozzy was a Vesper Hospice patient, had been for 7 months. The company that had been diverting end-of-life pain medication out of its own supply and moving it through a second grader's backpack had, for 7 months, been the company responsible for keeping Barrett's mentor comfortable while he died. Barrett drove out there at 4 in the morning and sat in the driveway until the sky went gray, and then he went in and asked Ozzy a question he had been afraid to ask, which was, "How's your pain been?" And Ozzy, who was the toughest man Barrett had ever known, and who had never once complained about anything, said, "Well, it's not great, honestly, but they tell me I'm at the top of what they can give me." Barrett went out to the van and was sick in the gravel. He had the evidence by the end of November. What he did not have was anywhere to put it. That is the part people don't understand about cases like this one, and it is worth 2 minutes of your attention. Evidence is not a magic object. Evidence is a thing you have to hand to somebody, and the somebody matters more than the thing. Barrett could have walked his 9 days of analysis into the Board of Pharmacy, and the Board of Pharmacy's inspector on this matter was Ward Fenneman, who had already framed the entire question as a calibration failure, and who, Barrett learned from a records request that took 6 weeks, had been a paid speaker at 2 Vesper regional conferences and had a sister-in-law on their contracts team. He could have taken it to Detective Teague, who believed him completely, and who had, by then, been informed by her captain that the Loomis matter was a domestic dispute with a pending custody component, and that the pharmaceutical angle was being handled at the state level. What Barrett had was a pile of true numbers and no clean chain to hand them down, which, if you have been listening, is a thing he happened to know a great deal about. So he did not hand it to anybody. He built a new link. The idea came out of the frame itself. If Vesper's story was that the balances were unreliable, then Vesper had a problem, because a compounding pharmacy that handles controlled substances is required to weigh on qualified instruments, and they had just told a state regulator in writing that theirs had been wrong for 14 months. Every one of those 5 instruments now had to be replaced or requalified, immediately, and the company that had been doing it for 2 years was under accreditation review and could not sign anything. They needed new balances, fast, from somebody who was not Barrett Loomis. There are exactly 2 distributors in Indiana who stock pharmacy-grade balances in quantity. Barrett knew both of them because everybody in the trade knows everybody. The larger of the 2 was a company in Fort Wayne that Ozzy Tinsley had put $40,000 into in 1994 and had held a quiet 9% of ever since, a fact that appeared on no website and in no brochure. Barrett drove to Fort Wayne on the 8th of December and had a 2-hour conversation, and then he had a second conversation with a lawyer, Odile Reardon, who he had hired with money he did not really have, and the shape of what he proposed made her put her pen down. He was not going to tamper with anything. He wanted to be very clear about that, and Reardon made him say it twice. He was not going to install a listening device, or alter an instrument, or plant a thing. What he proposed was almost aggressively boring. The distributor's catalog had 2 versions of the model Vesper needed: the base unit, and the same unit with the regulatory package. An internal, non-erasable, sequentially numbered audit trail that timestamps every weighing event, every calibration, every user login, every attempt to clear the log, and holds 240,000 records in protected memory. It is designed for exactly this. It exists because regulators require it in pharmaceutical manufacturing. It is a standard, publicly listed catalog option. It costs, per unit, about $900 more. Barrett Loomis bought the difference. He paid, out of a home equity line on a house he was not currently allowed to live in, the upcharge on 5 balances, so that the units the distributor delivered to Vesper Home Infusion and Compounding in the second week of January would be the compliance models, quoted and invoiced to Vesper at the base price as a promotional configuration. There was nothing hidden. The audit trail was printed in the manual. It was in the spec sheet in the box. There was a sticker on the back of each instrument that said, in 8-point type, GLP GMP audit trail enabled. Nobody read it. Nobody has ever read it. Barrett had spent 19 years watching people not read it. And so, starting on the 14th of January, every single time anybody at Vesper Home Infusion put anything on a scale, the instrument wrote down what it weighed, to the milligram, with a timestamp, under whichever user account was logged in, into a memory that could not be edited and whose deletion attempts were themselves recorded as events. Then Barrett went back to work, quietly, on the grain co-ops that had stayed with him, and waited, because he was a patient man, and because he had learned from Ozzy, a very long time ago, that you do not chase a measurement. You set up the conditions and you let the instrument tell you. The second half of it walked into his shop on the 1st of February, 17 years old, in a school parking lot jacket, with her hands shaking. Tansy Voiles had found out what her father did the way children usually find out, which is by accident and in fragments. She had gone to his office at the Vesper building on a Sunday in December to get keys, and there had been a man named Cal Brodeen in the hallway with a cooler, and her father had been extremely, memorably calm about it, and calm in the wrong way. Then she had started paying attention. Then she had gone looking on the family computer for a tax document for her college applications, and found, in a folder labeled with the name of a boat, a spreadsheet. It was not a sophisticated spreadsheet. It was 14 months of 2 columns and a set of initials, and one of the sets of initials was DL, and she had met DL at a company picnic, and DL was married to a man who fixed scales and had a son who counted things. She said, sitting in the front room of the shop with a cup of coffee she did not drink, "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing." And Barrett Loomis, who had every reason on earth to say yes you are, honey, hand it over, said instead, "I want you to call a lawyer before you give me anything. Not my lawyer, your own. I'll pay for the first hour, and I don't want to know what you say to her." Reardon would later describe that as the single smartest thing her client ever did, because it meant that when Special Agent Yolanda Kress of the DEA Tactical Diversion Squad out of Indianapolis finally sat down at a table with all of it in March, what was in front of her was not one bitter husband's revenge folder. It was a 17-year-old's independently counseled disclosure, a schoolteacher's contemporaneous handwritten log with 11 dated entries, a sealed and photographed evidence chain from the night of October 14th signed across the tape, 19 years of as-found calibration data showing a physically impossible error pattern, and a set of brand new instruments quietly writing down, in protected memory, exactly what was being weighed at 4:50 in the morning in a pharmacy in Winslow Gap, Indiana. Kress read for about 90 minutes. Then she looked up and said, "Mr. Loomis, do you understand what you've built here?" He said, "I built a traceable chain. It's the only thing I know how to do." She said, "I've had cases with 3 agencies and 2 years of wiretaps that were worse documented than this." What broke it open was the pharmacist. Dr. Marguerite Amboy was 56 and had been the pharmacist in charge at Vesper Home Infusion for 6 years, and she had signed every reconciliation report for 14 months, and she was, by the time Kress and Teague sat down across from her on the 19th of March, a woman who had not slept properly since the previous spring. She had been the one who had to sign the self-report. She had believed, at least at the start, that it really was the balances, because a VP had told her so, and because the alternative required her to believe something about people she ate lunch with. They put 3 things in front of her, in order. First, the as-found graph, with the natural drift curve of a comparable instrument at a hospital pharmacy drawn beside the Vesper curve, and Barrett's 1-page written explanation of why the second one could not happen in physics. Second, the environmental log from balance number 1, showing 22 manual calibration events at 4:50 in the morning, with the user account. The account was hers. She had never been in that building before 7 a.m. in her life. Somebody had been using her login for 14 months. Third, the audit trail from the new balance, installed in January, which listed a weighing event at 4:51 a.m. on the 24th of February of 61.94 grams under her user account, on a morning when Dr. Marguerite Amboy had been in Fort Myers, Florida, at her sister's wedding, which she could prove with a boarding pass. She asked for a lawyer, got one, and came back in 11 days with a proffer. The scheme was, in the end, exactly as stupid and exactly as effective as Ozzy's 40 pounds on a grain truck. Vesper Home Infusion received bulk-controlled substances, compounded them for hospice patients, and documented every gram. Everett Voiles had figured out that the only number in that entire system that was not independently verifiable was the very first one, the incoming weight. If the receiving balance reads high, the pharmacy's books say they got more than they got, and the excess exists only on paper, and paper excess can be removed from the shelf as physical product without the reconciliation ever noticing. To make the balance read high, at first, they simply had a bad instrument and got lucky. Then they made their luck. Calibrate, who had a key and an alarm code because he did after-hours transport, went in before dawn with a strip of steel shim stock and a small neodymium magnet in a foam block, adjusted, ran a manual internal calibration under a borrowed login so the instrument would accept its new lie as gospel, and left. Every 90 days, Barrett Loomis came in with his mahogany cases and his tongs and corrected it back, wrote an as-found number that nobody was ever going to read, and got a check. And the product came out in patient-sized quantities, which was the genuinely vicious part. It was never a truckload. It was the difference between what a dying woman named Arnett Pettibone was prescribed and what actually went into her pump. It was one patch of 3. It was a bottle of concentrate that was filled to the line with something that wasn't all concentrate. 22 hospice patients across 2 counties spent their last weeks in more pain than they had to, and every one of their families was told, gently, warmly, often by an intake and bereavement coordinator named Delaney, who was extraordinarily good at that conversation, that this was the maximum the physician felt comfortable ordering. That was the part Barrett could not get past. Not the money, the conversation. Somebody sat at a kitchen table and held a daughter's hand and explained that her mother's pain was as managed as it could be, and then drove home and put the difference in a lunch bag. And the lunch bag was the newest, and, in Voiles' mind, the most elegant part. They had used a courier and then a car swap and then a self-storage unit, and each of those had a failure mode, and then in August, Cal Brodeen made a joke at a barbecue about how the only thing in America nobody ever searches is a kid's backpack in a school pickup line. Delaney Loomis did not object. That is what the proffer said, and that is what the phone records supported, and that is what she eventually admitted. She did not object, and she filled the bag every 8 to 10 days, and she told her son it was a thing, not a secret. Ike's forensic interview had already been done in November by a specialist in a room with a 2-way mirror, and it had gone the way it goes when a child has not been coached and has not been contaminated by a parent asking leading questions in a kitchen. He said Mom put it in. He said give it to Cal. He said, unprompted, that it was heavier on Fridays. He said he didn't like it because it made his shoulders hurt, and he had asked if he could put it in the front pocket instead, and Mom had said no, all the way at the bottom. The interviewer asked if anybody had told him what to say today. He said, my teacher told me to show my dad. And then he said, but that was in October. The arrests happened on the 14th of April, 6 months to the day. They took Everett Voiles out of the Vesper corporate office in Indianapolis at 11 in the morning, on a floor with glass walls, which Agent Kress later admitted was not entirely an accident of scheduling. They took Cal Brodeen off the interstate near Seymour. They took Deke Stroud out of the Vesper warehouse, with a hand truck still in his hands. Ward Fenneman was placed on administrative leave the same week and charged in August with official misconduct and accepting an unlawful gratuity, and his defense at trial was that he had genuinely believed the calibration explanation, which the jury considered for 4 hours before deciding they did not. Delaney Stroud Loomis was arrested at her mother's house on Tillinghast Road at 6:40 in the morning with her hair still wet. Barrett was not there. He had asked not to be told the date, and Kress had honored it, and he found out the way everybody else in Winslow Gap found out, which was a push alert on his phone while he was under a truck scale at a co-op in Ellery County with a torque wrench in his hand. He read it twice, then he put the phone in his pocket and finished the scale, because there was a farmer standing there who needed to weigh corn, and because there was nothing else on earth he could have usefully done in that moment. He told me later, through the lawyer who put us in touch, that he had expected to feel something enormous, and instead felt like a man who had finally set down a case he had been carrying for so long that his hands had shaped around the handle. The trials took another year and change. Voiles went to trial because men like Voiles always go to trial. His attorney's theory was that a disgruntled contractor facing the loss of his accreditation had constructed an elaborate revenge narrative, and that the true story was a calibration failure and a domestic dispute that had metastasized. It was a decent theory. It had exactly one problem, which is that it required the jury to believe that 5 instruments in one building had all drifted in the same direction by the same amount in both winter and summer, and had remembered where they were after being corrected. The government called Barrett Loomis on the 4th day. He was on the stand for 2 hours and 11 minutes, and Reardon, who sat in the gallery, said it was the strangest direct examination she had ever watched, because it was so calm it was almost rude. He explained traceability. He explained what as found means and why he kept it. He explained, with the photograph on the screen, what an adhesive ghost under a weighing pan is. He explained why a magnetic force restoration cell responds to a magnet and why that is not a defect. It is the operating principle. And then the prosecutor asked him to explain to the jury how much was actually taken, and Barrett asked the judge for permission to use an exhibit, and Judge Osric Kalb, who had been watching this witness with visible interest for 90 minutes, allowed it. Barrett Loomis put on a pair of white cotton gloves. He opened a fitted mahogany case on the rail of the witness box and, with ivory-tipped tongs, lifted out a single small stainless steel cylinder and set it on a folded cloth. He said, "This is 100 grams. It is a Class 1 reference standard, and it is accurate to within 100 micrograms, and it is traceable to a national standard in Maryland." Then he said, over 14 months, the missing quantity in this case, converted to the base compound, comes to a little over 4,200 grams. And then he set out 42 of them, one at a time, with the tongs, in a row, in absolute silence, in a federal courtroom, while 42 small metallic clicks went into the record. The jury was out for 6 hours. Everett Voiles was convicted on 21 counts and sentenced to 19 years. Cal Brodeen took 11. Deke Stroud took 6. Ward Fenneman got 40 months and lost a pension he had 4 years left to earn. Vesper Care Partners paid a corporate resolution of $14.6 million, lost its DEA registration for the compounding operation, and no longer exists under that name, though most of the buildings are still there with different signs on them. Delaney pled. She got 7 years, and the sentencing transcript is a hard document to read, because her attorney's argument in mitigation was that she was a woman who had grown up with nothing and had been manipulated by a powerful man, and the argument is not even untrue, and it did not survive contact with the paragraph the government read into the record. That paragraph was a list of 11 dates. On each of those dates, a mother put between 600 and 1,100 grams of stolen end-of-life pain medication into an 8-year-old's backpack and adjusted the straps and told him to have a good day. Judge Kalb said, before he imposed it, that he had presided over cases involving far more money and far more violence, and that this was the first one in some years where he had needed to take a walk. The custody case ended in a conference room without a hearing. Barrett has sole legal and physical custody. There is a supervised visitation schedule that Ike may opt into when he is 12, which was Barrett's idea, over his own attorney's advice, because he said a boy is going to have questions someday, and he would rather Ike get the answers from the source than from the internet. The Board of Pharmacy closed its file on Loomis metrology in June with a 1-paragraph letter and no apology. Barrett had it framed anyway, next to Ozzy's certificates, because Reardon pointed out that a document clearing you is still a document. The business came back slower than it went. The hospital system took 2 years to return and then came back with a bigger contract. 3 of the pharmacies that had dropped him called and were embarrassed, and he said, "Honestly, forget it," and meant it. Ozzy Tinsley lived another 8 months. His pain, once his medication was actually going into his body instead of into a blue insulated lunch bag, was manageable, which is the word hospice people use, and which means more than it sounds like. He got to hear about the 42 weights. Barrett says he laughed so hard he had to go on the oxygen for a while, and then he said, "Well, you finally listened to me about something, The index card is still taped inside the cabinet door. Every number belongs to somebody. Arnett Pettibone's daughter Corliss was one of 9 family members who spoke at sentencing. She said that her mother had spent her last 11 days asking, over and over, what she had done wrong, because she had been told her pain was as controlled as it could get, and she believed she must have been failing at dying properly. That sentence is the one that ran in the newspapers. And Ainsley Ruddock still teaches 2nd grade at Wexford Elementary. She was investigated by her own district, briefly, for going into a student's backpack, and the letter of reprimand is still in her personnel file, and she has said publicly that she would do it again on a Tuesday. The spiral notebook with 11 dated entries in it is in a federal evidence room in Indianapolis. She testified for 40 minutes, and the defense attorney asked her whether it wasn't true that she had no authority, no training in narcotics investigation, and no proof of anything on the day she made her decision. And she agreed with all 3, and then said the only sentence she really wanted to say in that room, which was, "I didn't need proof. I needed the right adult." Ike is 11 now. He still counts. There are, according to him, 141 panes of glass in the front of the Ellery County Courthouse, which he counted while waiting for a hearing he was not allowed into. He works Saturdays in the shop, unpaid, mostly sweeping, occasionally allowed to read out numbers off a display while his father writes them down. Barrett told Reardon that the only thing he has ever asked of his son about the whole business is the same thing he asks of the boy every time he lets him near the granite table, which is that he keep his hands behind his back until he is told, and look with his eyes. I want to end by talking to one specific person, and it might be you. You are the person who has noticed something. Not proof, just something. A bag that's too heavy, a kid handing something to an adult, a neighbor's car in the wrong driveway at the wrong hour, a coworker whose numbers are always just a little rounder than everybody else's. And you have already run the arithmetic that Ainsley Ruddock ran in an empty cafeteria, which goes like this. I could be wrong, and if I'm wrong I look insane, and it's not really my business, and somebody with more information than me is surely already handling it. I need you to know that in this story, nobody with more information was handling it. The pharmacist in charge with a doctorate and a license was signing the reports. The state inspector whose entire job was catching this was on the payroll. The captain at the police department had already reclassified it as a domestic. Every single person who was structurally supposed to catch it either couldn't or wouldn't, and the only reason 22 hospice patients stopped being robbed of their last comfortable weeks is that a 2nd grade teacher with a spiral notebook and no authority whatsoever decided that noticing counted as a responsibility. And look at what she actually did, because this is the part people get wrong. She did not confront the mother. She did not post about it. She did not call in an anonymous tip that would have gone into a queue. She wrote down what she saw, with dates, and then she routed it to the one adult in that child's life who was in a position to act and was not implicated. That is it. That is the entire heroic act. 11 lines in a notebook and 1 sentence to a kid at a desk. There is a version of this where she waits for certainty, and certainty never comes, because certainty is not a thing that gets delivered to bystanders. And there's a version where Barrett Loomis grabs that lunch bag out of his son's backpack and dumps it on the counter and takes a picture of it in his own hands. And a very good attorney from Indianapolis spends a year explaining to a jury how a bitter husband staged a kitchen. Both of those versions are the same story with a different ending, and the difference between them is about 4 minutes of restraint by 2 ordinary people who were not sure they were right. So here's the whole thing, and it's the word we started with. Traceability means a number is only worth what its chain is worth. People work the same way. The truth about what happened to those patients did not survive because it was true. It survived because a teacher dated her entries, and a father kept his hands behind his back, and a 17-year-old got her own lawyer, and a man saved 19 years of boring data that nobody had ever asked to see. If you notice something this week, you do not have to be certain, and you do not have to be brave. You have to write down the date, and you have to find the right adult. That is a chain. Build one link of it and hand it to somebody who can build the next. I'm Nathan. Thanks for staying with me on this one.